Hello, fellow council executive directors, council staff, and council members. This is Kirsten Murphy. I'm the executive director of the Vermont Developmental Disabilities Council. I am also the president of the board of directors for the National Association of Councils on Developmental Disabilities, or NACDD. I know that given the current quickly changing federal policy environment, you may not have a lot of bandwidth for thinking about day-to-day governance issues for our professional association. That's understandable. However, in the service of just continuing to do our collective work, I'm here today to talk about NACDD's bylaws and an upcoming vote on whether to adopt recommended revisions to those bylaws. Specifically, this video is one of two that we're creating to explain the work that the board has undertaken to develop a new set of bylaws for NACDD. For a nonprofit corporation like NACDD, bylaws are the main governing document. They outline the rules and processes that guide the board's actions and decisions. They ensure that everyone is held accountable, follows applicable laws, and is working in the very best interests of our shared mission of NACDD. NACDD's bylaws have not had a substantial revision since early November of 2018. And as I'll explain in this video, the board identified some critical gaps in this document, as well as places where it was inconsistent, confusing, contradictory, and overly detailed. This began an almost 2-year process of working through revisions. At its quarterly meeting of January 21st, 2025, the board voted unanimously to recommend the revised bylaws that will now be posted on the NACDD member platform for your consideration. Here are the next steps. Only the Assembly, not the Board of Directors, only the Assembly, which is made up of our 56 councils, can change the bylaws. A 2/3 majority vote of the representatives present and entitled to vote is needed. Each council has 1 vote. Councils will vary in how they make a decision about an upcoming assembly vote. Some councils will have their executive committee or their full council weigh in. Some councils may simply have the executive director cast a vote. That is entirely up to the individual councils to decide. From our end, to follow the correct process in the current bylaws, the recommended revisions must be posted for member review for at least 30 calendar days prior to an assembly meeting. The board is calling for a special assembly meeting to be held on Tuesday, March 18th at 5 Eastern Standard Time via a Zoom link that will be circulated to the executive director listserv by Eric Berg. An accompanying email will explain the procedures for any proxy voting. As I said, this is one of 2 videos. This one focused on process, and the second one focused on content. If I only had time to watch one of these videos, I would pick this one. As you and your council decide how you want to vote, I think it's important to understand the careful process that has been undertaken by the board and by a number of people to craft a clean professional set of bylaws. Finally, please know that this video was recorded in 2 sessions. Most of this information was originally recorded for board members prior to their September 23rd, 2024 meeting. Because this information remains relevant and unchanged, it is now sandwiched between this introduction and a few updates at the end of this video, summarizing any changes that occurred between September 23rd and today. I'll now turn to a slide deck reviewing the process the board undertook to develop the recommended revised bylaws. Good afternoon. This is Kirsten Murphy, and this is a recording for members of the NACDD Board of Directors. This is intended to be a very short overview of the steps that have been taken since we last talked about the bylaws. It's my hope that this will provide you with a little bit of a starting point when we talk about this at tomorrow's meeting. I'm going to share my screen. All right. Mostly I'm going to focus on process issues. This is meant to help orient you and also kind of recognize that you might not have time to pore over a 15-page detailed document, but this will be a good starting point. So you will recall that about 18 or more months ago, the board appointed a special committee, which was chaired by Isadora Rodriguez-Legendre. And that committee met for quite a long time, well over a year. And that committee was charged with reviewing the bylaws. One, for sort of housekeeping issues, because there were a lot of inconsistencies. And two, because the board had adopted a process for removing a board member, and that needed to reside or live in the bylaws. And three, because there was some interest in increasing transparency, and the thought was that there might be mechanisms in the bylaws or ways in the bylaws that we could increase the board's transparency and consistency. So that committee worked very hard. However, there were some concerns with version 1 that came out of that process. They did excellent work. I'm not saying that they didn't. They really worked hard at it. But the board itself was uncomfortable, as you'll recall, with the idea of creating a separate governance committee, at least as described in version 1 of the bylaws. I had also noticed that there were some areas that were not addressed in that committee's work that in my short time as board president, I become aware were gaps, and it would be good to have those addressed in the bylaws. And then there was some inconsistency in the level of detail. So some sections of the bylaws in version 1 were very, very prescriptive, meaning they had a lot of detail and steps that were to be taken. And that seemed more like it belonged in policy than it belonged in bylaws. So Jill Jacobs and I met with the committee. We kind of discharged the committee, thanked them for their work, said that we would build on the work that they had done, but that we thought the next logical step was to try to get some professional consultants to help us sort out questions that we still had about what would make the most appropriate governance document for the board. So this became, or got us to, a second version of the draft bylaws. So we already have a contract with, we meaning NACDD, with Brian Cox and Wanda Willis, who know board work and council work quite well. We asked them to do a review. But Jill and I also thought it was very important that there be an independent consultant who has no particular relationship to NACDD, is simply someone with expertise in nonprofit boards. And Jill interviewed, I think, at least five candidates for that job, and found a consultant she was really happy with named Tony Capra. So we brought her on board as well. Brian and Wanda did a detailed reading and provided extensive notes and questions about the next draft. And then Jill and I met with Brian, Wanda, and Tony on September 13th to discuss and talk through some of those recommendations, the vast majority of which seemed quite sensible to me. I incorporated most of those suggestions and the thoughts that we had discussed, the five of us together, and that version 2 then went to Tony for her review. What changed between version 1 and version 2? The consultants were all in agreement that the governance committee, as conceived in the first version of the bylaws, would commit the board to possibly actions that the board couldn't necessarily carry out. It also seemed very cumbersome and bureaucratic and like a lot of, a lot of process that might be appropriate for a much larger organization, but didn't feel appropriate for our organization. At the same time, we talked with Tony a lot about the membership's desire to know that there were checks and balances in place so that if members felt the board was not appropriately policing itself, I guess, for lack of a better word, that there were ways that that could be addressed. So we continued to talk with the consultants about creating a grievance policy that will do some of that. And Tony also talked with us about other ways that a board can ensure that it is operating consistent with all the principles that a board should operate with. We got a lot of feedback from all three consultants as well that we needed to pull back on some of the level of detail in the bylaws, and that some of that belonged appropriately in policy. So some sections were moved, noticeably the detail around removing a member. That is still a possibility that is written into the bylaws. There's a statement about it, but the board will need to adopt in policy the detail around how that happens. I felt a need to provide some more consistency across our standing and special committees. It was a really kind of a hodgepodge. Every committee was a different size. Some had vice chairs, some didn't. It was unclear what the cycle of chair appointments was going to be. So I cleaned up some of that so that it was consistent with our general practices. And then we added back a nominations committee, similar to the way that we have used that in the past, to have an independent process to slate boards and members, new members to the board and officers. However, I was aware that the nominations committee was not in fact a standing committee of the board because it is elected by the assembly. So I broke that out into its own section. It is no longer listed as a standing committee. That's a little weedy, sorry. So version 3 came back to me today. Tony Capra worked over the weekend to review all of the material I had sent to her. And she, since this is her work, she had some standard tools that she uses to review the structure and content and essential functions to make sure that the bylaws have all the parts that they're supposed to have. And that was very, very useful. I have provided you with a memo that shows those tools and her review. And in fact, she only found 2 things missing: stating the location of the principal office or principal place of business, and adding a procedure for the disposition or getting rid of assets like principally money if NACDD were ever to dissolve or go out of business or merge, for that matter, with another entity. We had also asked Tony to give us some ideas about how best to provide a limit within the bylaws that holds the executive director to a certain kind of checking in with the board if the executive director wants to take on a large financial transaction, like a big contract. That was something that we've learned as we've been reviewing the contracts that NACD holds. That was not something that the board had brought to its attention, and some of those contracts have created some longer term burden, given that the board has financial responsibility for the organization. It seems logical that at a certain dollar value, the board should be able to weigh in on the size and length of a contract, not who holds the contract, but just sort of the level of commitment. That's pretty standard in nonprofit governance, and Tony tells me it's pretty standard to put that in the bylaws. So we have a placeholder for that, and it's something we're going to talk about tomorrow. So what are our next steps? Tomorrow, I want to discuss a very small handful of unresolved questions. You might also have questions that you want to bring to the meeting, or you can bring them later. I know that we're not giving you a lot of time to look at a lot of detail. I'm trying to keep this big picture for at least for tomorrow. When the board is ready, we will vote to adopt the final document, and that will be put before the assembly for an up or down vote. In other words, you can't take part of the new bylaws and not other parts. You have to say yes or no, this seems like the right direction to go. There have been lots of eyes on and a lot of careful thinking about this. I want to assure our self-advocate members and really all of us that once we have a final new set of bylaws, we will then create a plain language version of the bylaws, because by their very nature, bylaws are a little hard to understand, and we could all benefit from a plain language explanation. The board's going to continue to develop and adopt board policies, including the grievance policy, but there will be some other policies, for example, details around dismissing a board member should that ever have to happen in the future, that we will also add to what I'm hoping becomes a kind of board policy manual. And the board will continue to work with Tony on adopting practices that ensure that the board is checking on its own performance. We may not go in the direction of a governance committee, but we may well want to adopt things like a board assessment process, where there are some regular reviews to make sure that the board is functioning as in the very best interest of NACDD. That is my probably very poorly worded introduction, but I wanted you to have something to start with, and I look forward to seeing you all tomorrow. Thank you. Hello again. We're back to February 5th, 2025. This is just a short addendum to close the loop on the 3 final changes described as phase 3 in this video in the development of the bylaws. So first, the board at its last September meeting in Phoenix did choose to add language empowering the board of directors to approve expenditures that exceed $75,000 annually and or commit NACDD to a term exceeding 2 years. That felt like the right level for board oversight to make sure that longer term or larger commitments had the board behind them. Second, following the September meeting and finalized at the January 21st meeting, the board worked with Emmanuel Jenkins, who is a board member from Delaware, and also the chair. He's the chair of the board standing committee that's focused on self-advocacy. We worked with Emmanuel to finalize what this committee wanted to be named and how it would like to be described in the bylaws. The board felt strongly that those questions should be settled by self-advocates, and the committee asked Emmanuel to work with his group to come up with that language. So the committee has asked to be named the Committee on Leaders with Lived Experience. And like each of the standing committees, they adopted a short description. It's in plain language describing what the committee does. And it includes the requirement that the majority, not all, but the majority of members must be individuals who have a developmental disability. So that was adopted at the January 21st meeting. And third and finally, we were able to get language from Tony Capra, our consultant on board governance issues. She provided technical language around the process for the dissolution and or merger of the corporation, should that ever happen. That is not something we expect, obviously, but it is a contingency or possibility that bylaws typically address. It's technical. It's covered in the other video that reviews content. I will point out that the bylaws were somewhat inconsistent and needed to be cleaned up around making it clear that it is the board which has fiduciary or financial responsibility for the corporation. It is the board that is empowered to dissolve or merge the corporation and adopt a plan for the appropriate dispersion of assets. So those three additions have now been incorporated into the final draft, which is labeled version 4, final. And again, that the board recommends that the assembly adopt. So finally, I would just ask that if you have questions about anything you've heard in this video or in the next one, or about the bylaws in general, the first step would be to direct that question to me, and I will try to provide an answer, or I will find a way to get you an answer. I think this is more appropriate than directing them to the executive director, because the bylaws are more of a board governance document, and we all know Jill's super busy right now with all the things that we're trying to handle as an association. Anyway, I really appreciate you listening to this and thinking about how your member council wants to vote at the special meeting of the assembly. Thank you.